Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to this first webinar on foundation decarbonization and reuse. My name is Gerald Verbeek. I'm the chair of the conference on foundation decarbonization and reuse, and I'm also fortunate to be the moderator for today's webinar. During the webinar, the attendees will be muted, but it does not mean that you cannot interact. You have the Q&A box, and if you use that box to communicate with us your questions, then I will use those questions for the Q&A session that we will have after the two presentations that we have in store for you today. Because today I will be joined by Natalia Rucinska from Menard and by Jessica Oudhof from Arab, who will give a presentation highlighting different aspects of foundation reuse. But before we do that, and before I ask Natalia to start her presentation, let me give you just a little bit of background information about the whole concept of foundation reuse. Foundation reuse, and that's also kind of highlighted in the logo that we use for the conference that you see the top right-hand corner of your screen, is all associated with sustainability. And for most of you, the whole concept of sustainability will be nothing new, but for maybe there are some that are not completely familiar with it. Put it very simply, it is basically something where the environmental aspects, the social aspects, and the economic aspects overlap with each other. And if we have that situation, that sweet spot in the whole thing, that is where you're going to get then the most sustainable solution that we are trying to achieve. Sustainability, though, has a whole bunch of different aspects. And when sustainability was, the whole concept, the whole idea of sustainability was developed, the United Nations put together 17 Sustainable Development Goals that you see highlighted here. And one of those Sustainable Development Goals is goal number 13, which has to do, and I'll go too fast, I apologize for that. Sustainable Development Goal 13, and it has to do with climate action. And basically what the concept is that as we are putting more CO2 into the atmosphere warms up and we have more weather events, stronger weather events, whether it being hurricanes here in the United States, torrential rains in Spain, excessive heat in, say, the western part of the United States, or also excessive rain in parts of Morocco. It all has to do that there are weather effects. And it is then a call for all of us to reduce the emissions into the atmosphere. When you look at the emissions in the atmosphere, and when you look at what can be done, is that the building operations and building materials together cover about 40% of the total emissions, which means that our industry has a large role to play in those operations and in those limiting the emissions. But you can even go one step further. When you look at just three materials, concrete, steel, and aluminum, they're responsible for about 23% of the total global emissions. And those are the materials that we're using, especially concrete and steel. That's what we're using in our foundation industry. So if we can reduce the amount of concrete and steel that we're putting into the ground, we are reducing those emissions, and it will have a major effect. And that is then where this pyramid comes in. It shows at the top that ideally to completely reduce the emissions, you build nothing, but that's not really a realistic option. And the least you can do, as shown at the bottom, is that you minimize waste. Because obviously if you minimize waste, then at least you do something there to reduce the total emissions. But most of the time, what people think about when they're talking about reducing emissions is building clever or build efficiently. Build efficiently is to minimize the design loads or to perform more testing so that you can use higher resistance factors and therefore reduce the size of your foundation. And build clever is if you reuse materials, reuse aggregate, for instance, or when you are putting a steel foundation in the ground, recycle steel. And that's true, those options are there, but there is another option, and that is not, in my opinion at least, and in the opinion of the organizers of the conference, that is not addressed often enough. And that has to do with foundation reuse. And that's why back in 2022, and also again this year and again next year, we will start coming up with a conference to really focus on foundation reuse. The issue there is that when you look at the parties that are involved in a foundation design, there's reluctance, there's a hesitancy to start talking about foundation reuse. For the geotechnical engineer, foundation reuse may require him to assess the condition and the capacity of a existing foundation. Something that he has not designed, something that he was not involved with putting it into the ground, and therefore there are definitely risks involved. For the structural engineer, it means that he has to change his design, modify his design based on a foundation that is there, but it is not necessarily laid out in exactly the way that he or she would like it to be. So again, not an ideal solution. The architect has the same situation. He is now bound to put together something, a design that is constrained by the existing foundations, something that may not provide or allow for the most optimal solution of what he has or she has in her mind. The owner. For the owner, it is very tempting to go with an existing foundation because it may save quite a bit of money, but at the same time, you will have to work with a project team where most of the people are not very happy to go that route. And finally, when you look at the regulatory body or the building authority, the people that have to approve the design, certify the design, they have to deal with a solution or an approach that hasn't been applied all that often. And therefore, there are again additional risks involved. And so when you ask all of them, the same thing with the insurance company, it's again more risks. Are we really willing to accept it? And that means that when you're asking to vote on a proposal for foundation reuse, you basically get all negatives. People see it as something that is risky, hasn't been done before, so let's not do that. And as a result of that, in the end, it doesn't happen. And then the argument is often made that, well, let's face it, even if we were to reduce the existing foundation, it's not adequate enough. I have more loads, so I have to supplement it anyhow. And then I might as well just install a whole new foundation. And then I know exactly that I have a good foundation in the ground. As if a new foundation never has any defects or limitations. The end result is that we have an asset in the ground that we leave there and we take another approach and we basically don't take advantage of that asset. And that's the situation that we're dealing with. And that is a good transition to our first presentation by Natalia. She will look at the various parts of how do we navigate those stakeholder concerns when it comes to foundation reuse. So let me hand it over to Natalia for her presentation. Natalia, the floor is yours, and if you can share your screen, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerald. Good afternoon. So let me just share my screen with you. So just a second. Okay, can you see my screen, my PowerPoint slideshow?
Yes. Not yet in presentation mode, but we see your screen and we see your presentation.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, perfect.
Right, okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining today, and thank you very much, Gerald, for inviting me to present this interesting part to everyone today. Right, so today I would like to speak a little bit about different stakeholders and what their concerns are. So Gerald has introduced the subject a little bit. I will speak about it from the contractor's point of view, but with the outlook of the different parties involved in the process. So hopefully it will be comprehensive enough. So only in a few short words, I will have a brief introduction, understanding of what are the stakeholders concerned, what are the strategies to address them, two very short case studies and best practices from our own backyard here at Menard, where I work, looking further on a short conclusion. So not to prolong this introduction, let's look at what sustainability is. So Gerald has already spoke about that, but often when we hear sustainability, we think about the 3R principle. So the reduce, recycle, and reuse. How does that translate into construction industry? How is that relevant to us today? Let's look at them a little bit separately. So if we need to achieve our objectives towards the climate goals that are set in front of us, is it realistic to think that we can achieve all of that by reducing? Well, I am not so sure personally. I think it's very, very challenging. And this is supported by all the elements we can see around today about the growing economy and the growing population. If we look at the expected population growth, in the world, we expect that the world population will hit 10 billion people in 2100. And all of those people will have to live somewhere, they will have to work somewhere, they will have to commute. So this means that a lot of infrastructure will have to be developed, and I think it's unlikely that in the absolute scheme of things, we will stop building things, that the global needs will create demand to build and construct more. So if we think about reduction, we can think about another aspect of reduction. So not the absolute volume of what we are doing, but how we do it. So using less materials for our construction activities. So here a little chart. It's a chart comparing different ground improvement techniques. So this is what we do at Menard, for example. So those ground improvement techniques are an alternative to deep foundation. And even within these different techniques, you can see that the embodied carbon for a different range of technique can be very different. Techniques which require use of material are very heavy in emissions, while techniques that improve ground without using additional material are very low in emissions. So clearly that's a direction that we should all be going into if we want to reduce our impact on the planet. So moving to second R, recycling. So how are we doing when it comes to recycling? So actually we're not so bad in construction industry, because if we look at this chart, the green part is representing the percentage of construction generated waste. This is mostly in Europe. What percentage is recycled and which percentage is landfill. So landfill is really when we're not reusing it anymore. So this is the blue part. Green part is all forms of reuse of recycling or backfilling on site. So this is quite interesting, but it means also that we're very efficient while we're recycling. We are using these materials. Those are resources, so it's easy to do. So, okay, it's nice, but probably not so much room for improvement in most countries. So what about reuse? So here we are to talk about reuse, and we don't really know a lot about reuse because it's not so common. We don't reuse foundations very often. In fact, people raise their eyebrows when we speak about that. So let's think about why. So understanding stakeholders' concerns. So what are those concerns and what are the stakeholders? Let's start there. Who are the stakeholders in the construction process? So it will be the authorities, the industry associations, investors and owners, engineers, contractors, insurances, and communities. And what do we all worry about? What do we have in common when it comes to our concerns? So we worry about the cost. The solution has to be cost efficient for sure. We worry about the liability, and we worry about the feasibility and efficiency of our solutions that we propose. So let's translate it into the key challenges. Right. So everybody, all the stakeholders, they want the solution to be cheaper. Unfortunately, in most places, we are still in the environment where price is the driver for the project to go forward. In some places, there are some non-financial indicators which add value to the solution, but price generally still is one of the key aspects which is being evaluated. So it has to make sense financially. Whatever we do, it has to be efficient financially. So nobody wants to take the risk for design and performance when it comes to foundation reuse. It's risky because we don't know a lot about the foundation that's already in the ground. We don't know how to test it very well. We don't know if there is sufficient documentation from the old foundation, and we don't know how well it's going to act under the new loads and with new structures. So that's risky, and nobody wants to take that risk. So that's another one of those concerns which shall be addressed. Another one is that in many cases there is no existing regulations or codes for use of foundation. So okay, we maybe have a good project where we could propose foundation reuse, and we're worried about liability. So it would be nice to be able to refer to a code or a local standard which will hold our hand and help us deliver a very efficient solution. But that many of them, in many cases, does not exist, or it doesn't address the needs that we specifically have. One more challenge is that sometimes we would want to think about reusing foundation, but when we decide to do that, maybe it's too late because the decision has to be made in advance. If there is demolition works happening on the building, if the site is not prepared specifically, then we may not have anything that we can rescue for future construction. So those are the challenges. This is what we see. So let's think about how we could address those stakeholders' concerns. So to start with is, I started wondering what drives the reuse approach. When today do we go for a reuse consideration on our project? So for me, it comes down to money or must. So money is pretty clear. We already said the solution, it has to make financial sense, otherwise nobody will entertain it. So what can be the other driver? What's the must? So it can be a time constraint. Perhaps I don't have enough time to cast new foundation. I don't have the time to take a specialized geotechnical contractor to do the piling or ground improvement. And I can reduce my schedule if I use what is already in the ground. Availability of resources. So, this can mean a lot of things. It can mean construction resources, availability of concrete if we're in a remote location and concrete would need to be brought from afar. But it could also be as simple actually, as complicated as not having space to execute the works because we're working in a dense environment. We're in a very dense city like London or like Amsterdam or some of other European cities where space is limited and space for new construction even more so. So that's why reuse becomes the only option that we have in front of us, and we have to make it work. Regulation, perhaps. I don't know today. I don't think that's the case in many places, but maybe there is a minimum requirement for reuse on the project, and this is what could be the answer to that requirement. And investor community pressure. So that's something that could drive the decision to use the resources available to us. So how do we foster growth of the reuse approach today? So if we look again at the different stakeholders with which we have listed earlier, so if we look at authorities, so what could the authorities do for us today? They could think of some policies setting measurable targets for reuse adoption. We know that if there is no driver to propose in environment where it's easier to cast new foundation, it's probably not so interesting to think about reuse projects. There could be some, if we don't, so it's basically a carrot or a stick. So policy could be a stick, but we could also have some carrots and with some incentive programs which encourage participation and investment in reuse projects, maybe offer some financial benefits to projects developed this way. industry associations. So we could do some upstream work with the authorities to promote the reuse approach. And this is quite interesting and important. I think we could standardize with the industry associations the reuse approach. So provide this kind of methodological guide to hold people's hands when they are designing reuse approach, especially in countries where this is not very mature yet. So let's look at owners and investors. So owners and investors. Today with CSRD, with green taxonomy, we are all measuring and reporting the impact of our activities. And that is true for everybody, for all the stakeholders. But owners and investors, if they were measuring and reporting the impact of their projects and comparing the potential contractors doing the works for them on this basis, that could be the driver to limit the emissions and limit the footprint that we're creating with our works. And so that goes together with the integrating of sustainability criteria in projects. Engineers. So again, on the same subject, just more stakeholders. So what could engineers do? Engineers are writing specifications for projects. They could most certainly include some reuse conditions into specifications. They could call for reuse approach and this way motivate the potential contractors bidding for the project to consider that in their offers. Conducting feasibility study and assessments. We know this is quite challenging. We come to site, there is an old foundation, nobody knows how to go about it. What kind of study should we do? What kind of test should we do to understand what is the condition of the current foundation? So this is something where engineers could provide more guidance to the contractors, which later on do the work themselves. And again, we touch base on this subject that engineers could also contribute to developing reuse guidelines and tools. So contractors, my own backyard here. So we could build our capacity. We don't know a lot today on, well, we don't know, we don't do often a lot of foundation reuse. Perhaps we need some specialized know-how. Perhaps we need some specialized equipment. We need so this is capacity building. We could get prepared to do this kind of work efficiently and competitively. We could be promoting innovations through new solutions. Maybe there is a way to find a new methodology for more efficient testing, for more efficient underpinning, for example. And we could implement the reuse propositions into our projects and tenders. Communities. So communities, I think in a lot of places, this is happening today. They're advocating for sustainable development and they are participating in planning process. So people can have a say on how things are being developed in their own neighborhoods. So I have prepared two short case studies for you. So literally just 2 slides on each. One is a very small one and one is a rather big one. Just to show you that reuse can be applicable for every type of project. It can be interesting regardless of the scale of the development. And so one example is from Poland that has been shared with my colleagues here. It was in a building, it's an industrial warehouse where the client was looking to extend this warehouse. So the existing warehouse was standing on foundations. The client wanted to extend the warehouse. And the original proposition was to extend this warehouse on a new foundation. However, Menard, in this particular situation, has proposed to reuse the capacity of the existing foundations on the edge of the warehouse by installing micropiles under this warehouse, a foundation at the edge, and increasing the bearing capacity of this foundation, allowing the new warehouse to be settled directly on this base. So this gave the company the competitive edge to actually win the tender and do the works in a successful manner. And that is a nice example of, let's say, small scale project, especially by comparison with the next project, which is a very large scale project with an interesting foundation reuse as well. So the other project, the Feather project in France, it's a large wind farm development in France. And if we look at the wind farm industry, it's quite interesting because what we see is that the wind turbines, they are growing in size. So in the 1990s, they were 30 meters high. Today, we are in between 125 to 150 meters high. and those turbines are being replaced. So when they are being replaced from previous generation to the current generation, the traditional approach is to demolish this really massive foundation, which generates about 900 tons of concrete waste, and put a completely new foundation under the new wind turbine. So what the proposition of this project, where Menard is also involved, is to strengthen, instead of demolishing, is to strengthen the existing foundation, to allow this new generation wind turbine to be built directly on this new strengthened foundation. So a very challenging project, and this approach, so reusing the old foundation or modifying the old foundation, is actually generating cost saving, and is also good for the environment. So there was the environmental benefit of that. It's quite challenging because it's a complex design case, and it is involving a lot of different parties to make sure that this is a successful project. Some research institutes, contractors, insurance companies, everybody has to be working together. And I think this is quite important to mention, that collaborative approach between all stakeholders is generally what you need to have in order to have a successful project considering reuse. Right, so very quickly wrapping up, looking further. So what can we do to be more efficient? So the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting different results. Okay, so today we have concerns about reusing foundations. How can we build so that the future generations can go back to our construction, which we're putting in place today, and they can efficiently use the information we provide them and use the resources we provide them to use reuse in the future. So that's a different angle to look at it. How can what we create today be reusable in some years' time? And where can we start? Is industry and infrastructure a better choice than commercial and residential? Probably. It's probably a little bit easier. It's more repetitive. It's lower loads, more interesting, and less risky constructions. Right. So looking further from stakeholders' point of view, what should we do to be more efficient with authorities? They could set policies for future reuse aspects. Owners could think of building components as assets. So this, I think, is quite interesting. I'm an owner of a land which has some foundations in the ground already, right? Can I make my land more attractive price-wise because it is already reinforced for future construction? Maybe that's the way we should be thinking about this aspect as well. So engineers, as we've already mentioned, adding reuse to specifications and favoring reuse-friendly choices could be a good way to start as well. So what about contractors? So contractors could provide extended warranties for the works so that the lifespan of potential foundation is extended. But what does it mean for those contractors? Potentially less work in the future? Should they have to rethink the business model for the future? So a lot of interesting questions and a lot of interesting conversations for the upcoming conference. So that's where we're going with all of that. Very quickly, last slide to conclude. So reuse will be an essential part of future sustainable geotechnical construction. There is a lot of things that will force our hand to go in that direction. And we must collectively seek reuse opportunities on past projects as well as in our new projects as outlook for the future. And reuse must be yielding benefits to us. It includes cost savings, environmental conservation, and resilience. And last but not least, collaboration among all stakeholders is essential for navigating those concerns. And this is it from my side. Thank you very much. I look forward to meeting those online, hopefully in the conference, and discussing all of this in person next year. Thank you, Gerald.
Thanks, Natalia. Thanks for a very interesting presentation. And in a way, what is interesting, you put in your slide earlier that one of the challenges for engineers is to start incorporating reuse in specifications. And when I saw that, I thought it was a perfect link to the next presentation. And if Marcel can move the control, the slides now to what Jessica is going to present. Because in that slide, we're talking about incorporating reuse into specifications. The next presentation does not talk about incorporating reuse in the specification, but in the design approach. Jessica Oudhof with Arab is going to talk about the renovation of a big bridge in the Netherlands, where Arab came up with an alternate design where reuse of the foundation was being suggested. So with that, Jessica, the floor is yours.
Thank you. But I don't think you can see my screen, can you?
I see your...
You see my screen? I can't hear you anymore, Gerald.
Sorry, I see a slide with your presentation.
Okay, then we're good. Okay, thank you all for listening. I'm going to highlight one of the case studies that we've done, which is the renovation of the Van Brienenoordbrug, and then focusing on the foundation part. The Van Brienenoordbrug is a very large bridge in the Netherlands, one of the largest. It is located in Rotterdam. The main span is about 300 meters, and it's got 2 arch bridges as the main span. And this bridge the first bridge has been built in the 60s, and it has been doubled in the end of the 80s because of growing traffic. So here you can see on the left top side, you can see the 2 arches next to each other, and there's some photos of the construction of the first bridge and the construction of the second bridge next to the first one. The arches have the same span, almost the same width. But with the widening of the bridge, they took quite a bold approach in the foundation. Here we see a long section of the bridge, so the main arches, the North Pier and the South Pier supporting the arch, and there's also a bascule pier. But in the 80s, when they wanted to widen the bridge, here we can see the foundation. The green foundation is the old bridge. It's based on a caisson foundation. It's quite deep. It's been built half the 60s. And then when they wanted to widen the bridge, but because space was limited, they in the end decided to put the new West Bridge that you see on the left with one side on the caisson that was already there and with the other side on a new pile foundation. So they added some parts to the old caisson foundation, that's the pink parts, one to support the new arch and another one to ballast the loads so the center of gravity wouldn't change too much. And then they constructed the pier on the other side on piles. So in the cross section, the arch has 2 different foundations, and they are not connected. So of course the slab, the superstructure is connected, but the substructure is not. There's a small dilation in between the 2. So here we see a top view of these 2 piers. The green, the old one, then the pink, what they added to the old one, and the blue one where they widened it to support the new bridge. And also they've added a ship impact protection on the North Pier, that's the yellow part. A little bit more information on the piers. This is the piers from the 60s, a caisson foundation, underwater concrete, reinforced concrete. They're ballasted on one side because the arch is leaning on the inside of the caissons. And this is the extension they built in the 80s. So it's piles, it's like a box pile wall and raked piles in between to also take the lateral loads, and a concrete substructure on top. The new challenge is that the bridges need to be renovated because of the age of the bridges, but mostly because of the heavily increased both frequency and loads of the traffic. The superstructure is not sufficient anymore. It needs a lot of maintenance now, and it needs to be replaced. So the idea that has been taken is to replace the west arch by a new arch, bring that west arch that's been taken away to a yard, upgrade it so it's good again to go for 100 years, and replace the east arch with that renovated west arch. For the substructure, that had 2 implications. Because the new arches and the new deck will be heavier, there's an increase of load. And also there's a slight change of the bearing locations in the cross section. So that was the task, to see whether the foundation that we have there could deal with those loads, or if changes to the foundation were needed. I think a very good part of this project was that we had so much available information, especially from the 80s. We had 14 boxes with documents, letters, drawings, as-built information. It was really, really good. So we had a very good idea of how the design was thought through. All the design calculations were there, all the design drawings were there, but also a lot of as-built drawings were there. So we had a very good idea of what was actually there. We had the ground investigation that was done both for the bridge that was built in the 60s and the widening in the 80s. And we also had monitoring data since the 60s. In average, about every 4 years, this bridge is monitored in XYZ direction. And during the widening, the monitoring frequency had intensified. So we could also, from that data, we could see whether the foundation was sort of behaving as we would expect it to behave. Apart from the information that was already available, we also did new investigations. So we did ground investigations, CPTs. It was a bit difficult because there was a lot of scour protection, and sometimes it was difficult to get through. We did groundwater and open water chemical testing to see what the quality of the groundwater and the open water was. We did structural investigations mostly to the concrete, inspections and testing. Now here we've listed all the tests that were done. But because of the nature of the structure and the depth of the structure, there were a few things that we couldn't or didn't investigate. That's the condition of the precast pre-stressed piles, the concrete piles, and the underwater concrete. These were both at such a depth and so sort of impossible to reach that it was decided not to investigate those further. When all the data sort of was analyzed, the old data and new data, the first thing we noticed was that the differential settlement between the pile foundation and the caisson foundation was almost negligible. It was in between 1 and 2 centimeters, so very, very small. The deformation itself also showed that the structure was behaving well, so there were no anomalies. The general condition of the piers was good. There were some small defects, but nothing that couldn't be repaired or maintained. And the idea was that if we did these repairs and maintenance, we could achieve 100 years lifetime. So then we had to look at the load increase. Could the foundation take the load increase? And although the load increase was quite high at the bearings, because the new structure is quite a bit heavier and the traffic is heavier and wind loads are heavier, everything is heavier. Because the foundation itself is so heavy, these caissons and these pile caps and things, the load increase at the actual foundation level, so the geotechnical loads the increase was relatively small, between 5 and 10%. So we took an assessment of the substructure, and what we found was for the pile foundation, it did work, but we needed to redistribute the load a little bit more between the piles. So we did nonlinear springs, a nonlinear soil structure interaction calculation. So it could work from a total point of view, but we needed to strengthen the pile cap to make that redistribution possible. Also, there's another aspect to this is specifically for the Netherlands. In 2016, based upon research, the pile factors that determine your pile bearing capacity were significantly reduced in the Netherlands. There is a code though in the Netherlands about the reuse of foundations or the foundations of existing structures. And if your load increase is less than 15%, you can use those old factors. So that's the approach we took, but we also did a sensitivity calculation with the reduced pile factors, and then your factor goes from 1 to 0.7. So it could lead up to a decrease of bearing capacity of 30%. That all worked. So we designed the reinforcement of the pile cap. For the caisson, we did undrained and drained checks for the geotechnical bearing capacity. We did analytical calculations. We did 2 and 3D plexus calculations. So bearing capacity stability was all good. We also did some calculations to determine some deformations that were expected while lifting off the bridge and replacing the new bridge. We did checks for the pile foundation, structural checks. What you often see is that the structural checks are even more complicated or more difficult than the geotechnical ones because the soil generally doesn't tend to deteriorate over time, but structural materials do. What was good here that most of the piles did have a steel casing, so we could sort of consider that sacrificial and just calculate with the concrete and the reinforcement. So those were all checked as well. And the conclusion was that we can reuse the foundation as it is with the structural strengthening of the pile cap, but that's relatively easy to do. And then we can keep the foundation as is. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica, for an interesting presentation. Unfortunately, though, I understand that the project is on hold. So right now it's only studies. Do you think that it actually will be implemented, or are we having a situation that possibly we have to redo all these investigations again for yet a new design in the future when the project finally does go through?
I think it will mostly be what we've done will be reused, and I don't think there will be a solution where there's no foundation reuse, because the foundation reuse is it's almost unavoidable, because if you have to rebuild this foundation, it's your sort of hindrance, and it's going to be incredible. So I think the foundation reuse is whichever way the project goes, we'll still keep. We will keep it. Yeah.
Yeah. Which is then again a good link to what Natalia was saying in her presentation. And Natalia, if you could also turn on your camera, and if we can stop sharing this part for the Q&A, because Natalia was emphasizing that some places there is simply no space. And that doesn't. It's not only in Western Europe. She mentioned the cities. And this example, of course, we're in the water. But here in North America, when you talk about New York, San Francisco, Chicago, there's simply no more space. Over time, buildings have been replaced. They put in additional foundation or new foundation, and now the whole area is basically full with foundations. Before we start with the Q&A, you can still, as the attendees, keep adding questions in the Q&A box. If we don't get to all the questions, we will make sure that after this event, those questions will be answered to the people that asked the question. So don't worry if you don't hear an answer right now. The first question, though, for both of you is really, are things changing? Natalia already mentioned in her presentation. I'll start with her for an answer that it's unknown and people are reluctant. But do we see a change, or do you see a change in the industry? And then once you've your answer, the same question for Jessica.
Yes, I think we start seeing the change. I mean, the project I mentioned, the one in France, it's a very large scale project, and it's a large development. The constraints or the incentive to think about foundation reuse was very significant, and we will continue seeing that, because companies today, they have to report on a lot of different indicators for the non-financial reporting. So everybody will try to limit their impact, and showing a large project developed in a sustainable way is going to be added value for companies and their portfolio. So I really believe that foundation reuse in
Did I just use you, or no? See, Jessica,
No, I think Natalia
moving.
is oh, she's back, I think. We lost you for
Okay,
a few seconds, Natalia.
I don't know where I was stopped, but okay, yes. Anyways, I hope you heard my message.
Well, you lost you halfway through. You said that things are changing, and then you started talking about the project in France, and then kind of I lost you. Okay. While we're waiting for the link with Natalia to get better, Jessica, what's your view on this whole thing? Are we seeing a change in the industry?
Yeah, I think we're definitely seeing a change in the industry, both with public and private clients. I think public clients, they see, especially because if you look at infrastructure and the sort of what we need to do in the coming years in renovation and that aspect, we just don't have the luxury not to look at foundation reuse. It's just a given that we need to go that way. For private clients, we also see the tendency. It's partly from a sustainability point of view, but also sometimes economical, because the economical and the sustainable aspect, they can strengthen each other. It can work with both ways. So yeah, so I think we definitely see a change. We also see some hesitancy, and I think it's also sort of a change of mindset for people to and I think it needs to be considered really from the start of the project, because if you can't bring it in late in the project, because then it won't work anymore, because everyone has to buy into the concept. But I do see it getting to the agenda more and more.
Okay. The second question that came in about your presentation, Jessica, was fatigue in the pile. Was fatigue in the foundation, was it a design consideration, and how do you take that into account when you suddenly start adding 50, 60, 70 more years of design life?
Yeah, I think the fatigue loads at depth are relatively small, because the fatigue is actually the reason why the superstructure needs to be renovated, because both the frequency and the loads have increased so much for the arches. So that's the reason that this whole bridge needs that renovation. But we've also looked down at the piles level, and yeah, so it's been taken into account. And the bridge was originally designed for 100 years, so we're adding sort of to the piles. The piles were built in the late 80s, so we're sort of actually adding like 40 years to that design life. Yeah, but the sort of fatigue loads at that level, yeah, you must see the substructure, the concrete substructure is so large here. What you get down at the piles is looks very different to the loads at bearing level.
Okay. Coming back to the first question, Natalia, I asked then whether we see changes happening over time. Since you are within Menard looking at the sustainability activities and the whole organization, therefore in all kinds of different countries, do you see differences in geographical area where in some areas this whole concept of foundation reuse is maybe not common practice, but at least accepted, whereas in other parts of the world, it's still something that is not done? In other words, is there really a difference in opinion around the areas where you're working?
Yes, definitely. I think geographical location is a big driver for these things. Western Europe in general is very concerned with sustainability agenda. So that comes down to both foundation reuse and decarbonization as well, which is another aspect of the conference. So we have a lot of different set of requirements, but we also have access to more resources, and these resources being different range of materials, more modern equipment, better when it comes to foundation reuse, better documentation from past projects, which is also key for designing new structures on old foundations. In some other countries, developing countries, different locations, all of that is still a challenge. So definitely that is progressing in a slower manner. In Europe on top of it, but also in other places with very dense environment where we have high density of population. This is what we may face because we also have lack of space. So other than the environmental and sustainability concerns, there is just the scarcity of resource that spaces that can be driving this agenda. While in other places, we still have vast areas to be developed. I'm thinking about Middle East, parts of Asia. It's a different aspect.
Yeah. One other aspect, Jessica, that I'm interested in when we talk about the acceptance of foundation reuse, obviously to make life easier in the future, it would be nice if we have more information. You talked about the 14 boxes that you had from the Brienenoordbrug, but when you talk about putting in facilities or monitoring equipment in new foundations that you put in the ground right now, so that 30, 40 years we have more information about the condition of those foundations. Is that something that you see within Arab as well? Is that something that you guys are pursuing as you're designing new foundations?
Monitoring with regard to deformations, definitely. So you get these, it's relatively simple generally. I don't know about sort of monitoring of structural, for example, chlorides or something. I haven't seen that, I think, which is, I don't know if it has happened, but it's mostly, I think, yeah, monitoring that's focused on the behavior of the building. So at least that gives you a good indication that it is behaving as you have designed it to behave or as you have expected it to behave. Yeah. But maybe, yeah, it could be a good idea actually to for sort of durability of concrete, of steel, to have some, you could think of some relatively simple equipment in place to be able to monitor this during its lifetime. Because I think that is another aspect, is just lengthening the lifetime of structures is one of the best solutions if you look at sustainability.
Yeah. Okay, unfortunately, we have to leave it at that. And as I said before, other questions that come in through the Q&A box, we will answer those separately to the people that ask those questions. But I want to thank Natalia and Jessica for their presentations. And to close this whole thing, let me give some more general information about some other things that are coming soon. Because obviously, what we're doing here today is part of a larger effort to really promote foundation reuse. And one of the ways that we do that is by putting a lot of information on the foundationreuse.com website. This webinar will also, the recording of that will be on that website. But what we have there is not only information about previous conferences where you can see the papers and the presentations of all the two previous conferences. We also have a resource center where lots of documents, links to other webinars on this topic, or the reports on this topic are there. So definitely have a look at that if you're interested in the whole idea of foundation reuse. We will also have more webinars. What we are trying to do is every other month. So we'll have another one in the beginning of January, and then one in the beginning of March. So basically on the first Wednesday of each month, of an uneven month, have a webinar, 1 hour, not more than that. We'll really make sure that we will keep within the time, because I know we have plenty of other things to do. So you can count on that the presentations and the Q&A will be limited to 1 hour. But it's not only just, of course, more webinars. We will also, as I already mentioned, have the third annual conference, which will be held once again in Amsterdam. And the last week of March of next year, you see there the dates on the screen. Pretty much the same format that we have done in the past, where we're talking about 4 sessions, looking at this concept from an owner's point of view, looking at it from a testing and evaluation point of view, looking at it from a design point of view, and looking at it from a construction point of view. And this webinar, we really focus on the last 2 aspects, and we will look at the, hopefully in the next webinar, look at some other aspects as well. One of the keynote speakers that we have already booked for this upcoming conference is Ernst Niederleitinger, who is the head of the group that deals with the foundation reuse, or the testing and evaluation of foundations to be reused within the German authorities, the BAM, and he will give his views on the evaluation of the existing foundations for foundation reuse. But it's not just that conference in Amsterdam. We're also very fortunate that we have 2 months later in Brugge or Bruges in Belgium, there will be a joint DFI EFFC conference where Geotechnics Reimagined is the theme. They will undoubtedly also pay a lot of attention to the sustainability aspect, more probably on decarbonization, whereas the conference in March will focus more on foundation reuse. And then we will have a workshop in September of next year, and the call for papers has just been published together with the Canadian Geotechnical Society. The CGS has a conference every year, an annual conference. It will be in Winnipeg in September of 2025. And the day before that, they will have a workshop purely dealing with foundation reuse. And that will be the first time, because we'll do it together with the CGS, that we move this conference or this discussion to this side of the pond, to North America. And we'll do it in Winnipeg in September of 2025. So that's what we had for you today. Once again, I want to thank Jessica and Natalia. When I asked them to give these presentations, they said very gracefully yes, that they would be willing to do that. I hope you found them interesting. I hope that if you are interested in foundation reuse, that you go visit the website foundationreuse.com. And I also look forward to seeing many of you, if not in person, at the upcoming conference in March of next year, as Natalia already mentioned as well, and otherwise at the next webinar that will be held on the first Tuesday of January. Thank you for being here, and have a nice day.